In order to answer the question, what is wrong with legislation, it is important to identify what good legislation would be like. And this is not an easy question, and it certainly doesn't have a unique and easy answer. Different authors attribute different qualities to good legislation, but there has been no agreement so far. But what if we looked to define good legislation from a completely different perspective? If one sees legislation as a mere tool for regulation, then the goal becomes clearer, albeit result-driven and result-related. Let me explain this a bit further. So governments are elected to govern on the basis of their electoral mandate. Governing involves the regulation of fields of activity, and such regulation may be achieved, amongst others, and preferably not, via legislation. So legislative drafting is basically undertaken as a means of achieving regulatory aims. If we follow that thread of thought, then good legislation is legislation that produces the types, extent, and level of regulation required by the government. And good legislation and drafting virtues are concepts that support and promote legislative quality in the sense of effectiveness, effective legislation. So why is legislation bad at the moment? The Good Law Project in the United Kingdom has identified three groups of users. We have lay users, people who have no topical or legal sophistication and read legislation in order to get answers to their everyday questions. Then group two is members of non-legal professions who are used to reading legislation and read it without legal sophistication in the course of performing their professional duties. And then, of course, our group three is lawyers and judges. They all read and they all use legislation, albeit for different reasons. Unfortunately, at the moment, legislation seems to be addressed to only one group, lawyers and judges, and this is really what is wrong with it. So legislation is bad because it speaks or is designed to speak to lawyers and judges. Well, does this matter? In order to contribute to the achievement of the desired regulatory results, legislation needs to speak to all three users. It is important that they all understand what is offered to them by means of rights, and perhaps most importantly, what is requested from them by the legislation. Without understanding what is offered and what is required, even those users who are willing to comply with legislation are unable to do so. They don't understand what they're expected to do. And this is problematic. It's not only problematic from the point of view of compliance with legislation. So it's not just problematic because even those who are willing to comply with legislation fail to do so, but it is problematic from the point of view of legislative success as well. Without understanding what the legislation seeks from its users, they cannot contribute to the regulatory effort. In other words, they do not comply with the legislation, their behaviors do not change, and regulation fails. And that has even longer term effects. And that perhaps is even worse, because users have become suspicious of legislation. They expect that legislation carries a hidden meaning, even when it is drafted in simple terms. And that creates a detachment from legislation in general, but also a detachment from those who actually legislate. So bad legislation does not just affect the result, the success of legislation. It does not just affect the result of regulation. It affects adversely loyalty of users, especially lay users, to those who legislate, to our governments, to the authorities, and so forth. So legislation at the moment is wrong because it only speaks to one of the three groups of users. And this is quite problematic, both from the point of view of legislative success, effectiveness, efficacy, regulatory success, but also from the point of view of loyalty and trust to the government.